Apple is putting more of its supply chain where its customers are, at home in the United States. The company says it will expand its American manufacturing program, adding four new partners to its domestic supply chain and investing about $400 million in the initiative through 2030. Bosch, Cirrus Logic, TDK, and Unity Electronics will manufacture materials and components in the US for Apple devices that will ship all over the world. And Apple says it expects the program to generate new jobs. On top of that, the company plans to stop producing the Mac Mini at its Houston plant later in 2026. So, what actually changes when designed in California starts to mean built down the road? As you listen, keep this question in the back of your mind. When a company like Apple moves out of manufacturing closer to its biggest market, is that just a branding story, or does it really change how resilient, innovative, and accountable business becomes? The announcement in plain English. Let's start with what Apple actually said. The company is expanding its American manufacturing program, a long running effort to support US production of key parts and technologies to go into Apple products. As part of this latest phase, Apple plans to invest $400 million between now and 2030 in US facilities and suppliers tied to this program. Four new partners joining the domestic supply chain push: Bosch, Cirrus Logic, TDK, and Unity Electronics. Together, they'll manufacture components and materials in the United States that end up inside iPhones, Macs, iPads, and other Apple devices sold globally. And then there's headline friendly hardware move attached. Apple says Mac Mini productions will begin at its Houston plant later in 2026, a rare example of a mainstream Mac line being made on US soil, not just high end or limited brand devices. Is this politics, strategy, both? Which leads us to our second question. When Apple leans into US manufacturing, what is it mostly responding to political and regulatory pressure, or is there a deeper operational and strategic logic that makes this a more patriotic photo op? Who are these partners and why they match? To understand the move, it helps to know a little about these four names. Bosch is a global powerhouse in sensors and electronics. For Apple, Bosch's US operations can produce sensors and other silicon adjacent components that feed into iPhone and watch features like motion tracking, environmental sensing, and more. Cirrus Logic is a long-time Apple supplier best known for audio chips. The little piece of silicon handles sound processing, microphones, speakers, and voice features across iPhones, iPads, AirPods, and Macs. EDK is a major player in passive components, batteries, and storage. Think capacitors, inductors, and other parts you never see but that make modern electronics possible. And Unity Electronics, while less of a household name, is focused on specialized components and modules that slot into larger systems. Exactly the kind of mid-tier supplier Apple needs if it wants to be a deeper domestic parts player. By pulling these companies more tightly into the US manufacturing program, Apple isn't just assembling final devices here. It's encouraging upstream layers of the supply chain, parts inside the parts, take root or expand inside the country. That's important because supply chains are like ecosystems. You don't get a robust final assembly industry with reliable local access to specialized components, tooling, and know how. What Apple gets out of this? A few intertwined reasons. Number one, resilience. The last few years, from pandemics to geopolitics, exposed how vulnerable concentrated supply chains can be. More domestic production gives Apple an additional lever if there are disruptions in Asia or Europe, whether from disease, war, or trade disputes. 2. Speed and collaboration. Having some key partners physically closer to Apple's US engineering and design teams can shorten feedback loops. It's easier to iterate a component when a plant is a flight away, not half a world away. 3. Political capital. Apple operates in an environment where lawmakers, regulators, and public are increasingly asking how much value is being created at home. High profile US investments and job creation have helped Apple make the case this is not just a company that sells expensive gadgets in America, it's also building and supporting industrial capacity here. And number 4, brand narrative. Designed in California has always been a part of Apple's story. Expanding made in America elements, especially for visible products like the Mac Mini, gives Apple a new, concrete example to point to when it talks about its presence in the US. So, can you localize manufacturing without giving up global efficiency? That sets up a third big question. How far can Apple push into local manufacturing for resilience and goodwill without losing the cost advantages, volume, and flexibility that come from the massive, globally distributed supply chain? Job, skills, and the Mac Mini in Houston. Apple says that it expects the expanded American manufacturing program to create jobs through detailed numbers still to come. The impact will likely show up in a few different ways. Direct jobs run by Bosch, Cirrus Logic, TDK, and Qnity Electronics in the US, as they would add production lines and support staff. Indirect jobs at suppliers, logistic providers, and service firms that support those plants. New roles at Apple's own Houston facility as it gears up to produce the Mac Mini. The Mac Mini is a particularly interesting choice. It's a compact, relatively modular, and clear appeal in enterprise, education, and creative markets. Exactly the kind of consumers who might care about a made in the US story for data sensitive or regulated environments. At the same time, producing a mainstream product like Mac Mini rather than limited run special edition in Houston would serve as a test bed. Apple can learn what works and what doesn't in higher volume US production, then decide whether to expand that model to other devices. For workers, these kinds of roles can look different from traditional factory jobs. Modern electronics manufacturing is highly automated, so the mix tends to skew towards technicians, maintenance specialists, line engineers, and quality control. Jobs that blends hands-on work with increasingly sophisticated technology. So, the bigger picture: tech, policy, and home shows. Zoom out, and Apple's announcement sits on a broader trend. The US government has spent the last few years rolling out incentives and regulations aimed to bring a more critical manufacturing back within its borders. Think semiconductors, batteries, and certain strategic technologies. Companies from chips to EVs have announced new plants in places like Arizona, Ohio, Texas, and the Southeast. Apple isn't suddenly making everything in America, but signaling that some portion of its future chain can be more diversified, with the US playing a bigger role than it has in decades. For policymakers, this is a proof point. One of the world's most valuable companies is willing to commit hundreds of millions of dollars and big name partners to domestic production, presumably because of the mix of incentives, risk reduction, and brand value makes sense. For other companies, there's a competitive angle too. When Apple shines spotlight on specific suppliers and regions, it can catalyze more investment in local ecosystems. Universities, training programs, and small firms that orbit around those larger anchors. So, let's return to the three questions we've been threading through the story. Number one, what actually changes when design in California starts being built down the road? Apple's expanding program suggests that over time, more of the value chain, from components to final assembly will sit closer to its biggest market, potentially making the company more resilient and giving it a different kind of accountability to US workers and communities. Number two, is this politics strategy or both? It's hard to disentangle. It's clearly political and reputational upsides in announcing the new US manufacturing and jobs, but there's also a serious strategical rationale. Diversify risk, tighten feedback loops, and create a domestic base that can support critical products if global conditions worsen. And number three, can you localize manufacturing without giving up global efficiency? That's a long term experiment. If Apple can run a hybrid model, some products, some production close to home, where cost and scale are most favorable, it might end up with a supply chain that's both more resilient and more responsive, without losing the advantages that helped it grow in the first place. I'm your host, Sishank, and once again, this is Business Insights Daily. So, as you see, made in USA, labels show up on a few more devices in the next few years. Maybe even on a Mac Mini. It might be worth asking not just where was this built, what kind of industrial ecosystem is quietly forming around that label, and how is it changing the way companies like Apple think about risk, innovation, and responsibility. As always, I'm your host Sashank. We'll see you next time. Stay informed and stay ahead. Thank you for listening.